Thank you for watching MML's Commentaries. Please stay tuned to learn more about this video's sponsors.
Back in the day, before Plants vs. Zombies was the name of a graphic novel you could physically purchase and own, it was an extremely charming and well-executed tower defense game that got people talking. Tower defense games are inherently inaccessible to the more casual video gaming demographic. In some sense, they're micromanagement games. They feature droves of enemies coming in from all directions, all with different abilities and variations to take down your base. And in response, players have all manner of offensive and defensive tools at their disposal, each with their own strengths and weaknesses. It's a genre inherently about overwhelming the player. To succeed, one has to understand what every unit can do, recognize what outcomes could happen, and prepare for the worst of these outcomes. This can be a lot for gamers unfamiliar with the genre to process, giving it a pretty high barrier of entry. Thankfully, games like Plants vs. Zombies, directed by George Fan and published by PopCap, do a fantastic job at simplifying a lot of these staples of the genre and contextualizing them in a way that makes the madness easier to process. The entire concept of scrolling across a large map is entirely removed thanks to the context of an entire level being set within a personal garden. Instead of coming from all directions, enemies always enter from the right side of the screen. Conveniently, they're zombies, so they move fairly slowly, giving players plenty of time to figure out the appropriate course of action. As the title of the game suggests, the other side of the lawn is where the plants go, all individually planted by the player as they see fit. The lawn's conveniently organized in a grid-like fashion, and outside of some extraneous circumstances, zombies will always stay on the same row as they entered the screen on. The zombies mostly walk to the left, and the plants, facing to the right, serve as the lines of defense between the zombies and your metaphorical brains. The plants are all clever spins on real-world vegetation. Both their names and appearances hint at their purpose in a more explicit way than in other tower defense games. The walnut, as its name suggests, creates a physical barrier that will take zombies some time to eliminate. Squash does exactly that. The pea shooter is also self-explanatory, and the names of its variants imply their differences, from the aptly named repeater and split pea to the war-ready look of the Gatling pea. The animations, both of the plants and the zombies, also do a fantastic job at communicating both what everything does and how everything interacts. Seeing a zombie run up with a pogo stick and vault over a plant both adds to the charm of the experience and effectively illustrates the gimmick. But seeing that same zombie try the same thing and smash their face into a tall nut does all of that while also clearly communicating the result of the player's effective planning. Plants vs. Zombies may at first glance also be described by some as a clicker game, but the clicking keeps the player directly invested and engaged in the action on screen. The effectiveness of any particular plant setup hinges on the player's ability to manage the game's primary resource, appropriately, sun. Sun currency descends from the sky at semi-regular intervals and is used to purchase plants. In order to have enough sun to build an adequate defense, however, players will have to speed up this process through the planting of sunflowers. This creates a number of risk-reward dynamics, as planting more sunflowers may net the player more of the game's most important resource, but sacrifices lawn real estate to make it happen. More pertinently, it also sacrifices the player's attention, as taking the time to click on all the generated sun inherently pulls their eyes away from the impending threat on the other side of the screen. In addition, defeating zombies nets the player coins, a form of in-game currency that players can choose to spend on a variety of additional tools. Throughout normal play, players will be awarded new plants that become more imperative to their success, but auxiliary plants like the Gloom Shroom and Twin Sunflower can be purchased if the player thinks they'll help. Alternatively, they can purchase additional plant slots so that they can equip a wider variety of plants for any given level. Without collecting coins, neither of those things can be purchased, but taking the time to collect coins diverts the player away from everything else they need to take care of. From planting to collecting to digging to earning, Plants vs. Zombies is inherently a game about figuring out what click should be made next in an environment where there's an uncountable amount of things to click.
Like the subscribe button. Subscribe to the channel and be sure to ring the bell, twist the doohickey, turn the wrench, go into your settings, find the I like to drown in a sea of meaningless content option, make sure that's turned on in order to be notified about future uploads to the channel. And guess what? We're uploading to MML's commentaries every single day from here on out. That's right, it's the same MML's commentaries you know and love, but watered down beyond recognition to meet the tight upload schedule, with only a hint of what you once knew to make you feel like you're getting something meaningful out of your viewing experience. We're running this content mill dry, baby!
There's an inherent balance that makes a game like Plants vs. Zombies work. Challenges in the game have to be cleverly designed such that the player will always have just enough tools at their disposal to take on the zombie horde. If they have the ability to acquire too much sun or lay down too many plants, then the challenge essentially evaporates. But if the player doesn't have enough time to adequately prepare and execute, then any effort on the player's end will feel somewhat fruitless, or vegetable-less, and they'll hit a sort of brick wall. The conclusion that George Fan and his small development team came to is that merely increasing the amount of zombies in any given level won't make for a compelling difficulty curve or a fun game. Instead, the decision the team made was to constantly introduce new things for the player to think about, whether it be a new plant, a new type of zombie, or a new gimmick with the lawn itself. These elements force the players to adapt in different kinds of ways and give players a little more to consider with every addition. One of the most brilliant decisions in the entire game is how its campaign is split up into 5 distinct chapters, each of which take place either in a different part of the house or at a different time of day. After 10 levels of slowly acclimating to the basic mechanics of the game, Chapter 2 throws a wrench in the player's understanding of how the game functions by removing the sun falling from the sky, and forcing players to rethink the game's most pivotal resource. Then, any relief of returning to daytime is completely squashed when play moves to the back lawn in Chapter 3, handicapping the capability of 2 entire play lanes. Chapter 4 obfuscates the vision of half and sometimes all of the playfield. Finally, Chapter 5 throws in the biggest wrench of all, rendering the entire pea shooter line of plants practically useless and severely limiting the player's planting area through the use of flower pots. The key with all of these changes is that with those new challenges come new tools to address those challenges. Night comes with the Zero Sun Puff Shroom. Water comes with aquatic plants and lily pads. Fog comes with lanterns and blowers. And the roof comes with cabbage-pults. Balloon zombies may fly over all of your plants, but the tall nut, cactus, and blover can all effectively deal with them. Bungee zombies may steal a plant, but an umbrella leaf or a well-timed jalapeno will do the job. True to the primary loop of the game, these additions serve the same exact purpose as the sun and the coins and the planting. They give players just one more thing to manage, one more thing that diverts attention away from the regular zombie horde. With all this taken into account, using the term clicker game for something like Plants vs. Zombies seems like a pretty gross misrepresentation of what the game actually accomplishes in comparison to other clicker-style games. On the other hand, however, George Fan played a major role in the development of that clicker genre to begin with. Fan's first game, released back in 2002, was Insaniquarium, a web game about clicking to feed fish, clicking to defeat aliens, and clicking to collect coins. The game was picked up by PopCap Games, fresh off the success of their hit Match 3 game Bejeweled, and re-released in a deluxe physical format. Shortly after, Fan quit his full-time job at Blizzard Entertainment and got to work on what would eventually become Plants vs. Zombies, partnering with PopCap once again. Perhaps somewhat surprisingly, Fan got a decent amount of pushback from PopCap's higher-ups on the title. Plants vs. Zombies may be an elegantly simplified version of the tower defense game, but when compared to the Match 3 games of the world, even the simplest of more complicated genres is nonetheless more complicated. At the time, producers assumed that the casual gaming audience's capabilities couldn't extend far beyond Minesweeper and Virtual Solitaire. Fan wanted to place more trust in players, however, and believed that the game's inherent design would be enough to help players understand how the game works. As a bit of a compromise, however, the final game ended up featuring a lot of more simplistic minigames, of which one directly drew inspiration from Bejeweled, which reward the players with the game's virtual currency. The idea behind this compromise was that players would spend their time enjoying these more simpler activities and be rewarded for it by making their first playthrough of the main game somewhat easier. Whether this was necessary in a game that's already quite easy on its own is debatable, but it was nonetheless a meaningful compromise that doesn't affect the regular user experience severely.
I have all these apps and services, and there's nothing for me to watch.
Is there nothing for you to watch?
Who's that? What are you saying?
Would you be interested in a DVD set?
DVD set?
In high quality 480p?
480p?
That's right.
Anything I could possibly want to watch from the MML's Commentaries history?
Well, I didn't get that far, but yeah.
What else could I possibly want?
There's nothing else you could possibly ever want with the MML's Commentaries DVD set, complete with all of the videos that you can already access on the internet for free. And that's it. Go buy it.
I'm gonna go buy one right now!
Ultimately, fans' design philosophy was correct, and Plants vs. Zombies blew up almost instantly upon release. Players of all experience levels took to the game's unique charm and fell in love with the compelling tower defense gameplay. This game almost single-handedly proved that casual consumers were able to latch onto more complicated gaming genres. Around the same time as Plants vs. Zombies' release, another major change was happening, however. One that would completely change the casual gaming scene, but perhaps most importantly, would revolutionize the entire world of portable computing as people knew it: the iPhone.
An iPod, a phone. Are you getting it? And we are calling it iPhone. Today, Apple is going to reinvent the phone.
One of the earliest visions for fans' next game after Insaniquarium was a direct sequel targeted at the Nintendo DS, which, along with the PDAs of the late 90s and early 2000s, helped establish touch as a potentially useful input method for mobile devices. When the iPhone released, however, everything changed, as it not only completely changed the utility of the cell phone, it also completely changed the utility of the computer, the television, and the game console. Why would someone want a personal computer if they can do everything a computer can do on their smartphone or a tablet? Why would someone want something as specific and niche as a portable gaming console when their phones can do that and check email and browse the web and still function as a telephone? For the more dedicated, the answer to that question is quite simple. A phone or tablet just isn't as good at doing the things that all of these dedicated devices can do. But for casual fans, none of those things mattered, and the games that they were used to on their computer, the Minesweepers and Solitaires, functioned just as well, if not better, on touch-focused mobile devices. Plants vs. Zombies' status as a clicker game made for a perfect fit on these mobile platforms, but with that migration came an inherent problem with how these platforms functioned. The iOS App Store, being quickly flooded with all manner of rushed-out content, was an inherently oversaturated platform, and the only way to stand out on it was to sit high up on the top charts. The issue was that the main metric of success on these charts was downloads, not revenue. The top grossing chart wouldn't be added until later, and even when it was added, it was difficult for consumers to understand how that chart differed from the normal top chart. The App Store, along with its Android equivalent, favored low-cost or free applications, meaning that Plants vs. Zombies had to slash its cost way down on mobile in order to compete. As such, a $20 game that had the love and care of a small development team poured into it was being sold for less than a quarter of its initial price. Thankfully, the game's success story on mobile is even greater than that of the initial PC release, but it came at the cost of undercutting and undervaluing the hard work that the developers, the true artists, put in. When it became time to make a sequel to Plants vs. Zombies, it was a no-brainer from PopCap's perspective for it to be designed specifically for mobile devices. By the 2010s, the era of casual PC gaming had largely come to an end, being almost entirely supplanted by the juggernaut of mobile phone and tablet applications. While some fans of the PC original might have returned for a similarly priced sequel on those platforms, the casual audience that PopCap knows best and the original Plants vs. Zombies capitalized on had almost entirely abandoned the platform. While focusing on mobile devices with a single input method would inherently streamline development, there would also be a whole host of new problems that would have to be addressed in order to get this thing off the ground. The first Plants vs. Zombies was built by a small team of less than 10, and already saw tremendous success on PC before the mobile port happened. The sequel would be developed by a far larger team, but would only see release on a platform with an inherently slimmer pricing model. Even after new charts and search methods theoretically enabled higher price applications to get some degree of exposure, from Infinity Blade to Monument Valley, consumers were already conditioned to expect their media to be freely accessible or extremely discounted, from their music, to their movies, to their video games. Just a few short years after the launch of the iPhone, the industry is about to change again in a massive way.
The internet subscription model for media delivery at first seems like a very pro-consumer business model. Instead of being beholden to the limitations of physical media or the unchanging feed of cable or radio, users can choose to consume whatever media they want on the platform whenever they want. It also seems like a very pro-artist business model on the surface, because thanks to the power of the internet, everyone is inherently more discoverable. Independent artists appear to be on the same level as the powerhouses of the industry, and thanks to fixed pricing, it will inherently be as valuable as that of any other product on the market.
Peeling back a few layers reveals the inner, more sinister nature of these sorts of business models, however. For starters, the second a consumer stops paying for these services, regardless of how long they were paying before, they instantly lose access to all of the media on the platform. In addition, platform holders are free to modify, change, or remove things from the platform at will without consumer consent. It may seem pro-artist, but reducing pricing to a flat monthly fee inherently devalues all of the art on the platform. And the responsibility for paying artists fairly falls not on the users, but on the platform holders.
While the film industry hasn't quite gotten to the level of exploiting artists in this way, the music industry has, and even some of the most successful musicians have expressed trepidation and even disgust at the current state of media distribution. The base problem with these service models is that they are inherently volatile for all parties but the service provider themselves. Users can lose access to content on the platform with no warning. An artist's share of revenue can vary or disappear with no warning. Despite this, through the veneer of convenience and affordability, consumers have been duped into thinking that these platforms work to their benefit. So the decision made at PopCap wasn't to put Plants vs. Zombies 2 on an existing platform, or to launch a Netflix-style service with the highly anticipated sequel at the helm. Instead, it was decided that Plants vs. Zombies 2 itself would become a service. A decision that mirrors the business philosophy of gaming juggernauts like Electronic Arts, who purchased the studio in 2011. In its best case scenario, this games-as-service model would resemble something like Nintendo's team-based shooter Splatoon, a game with a set entry price that continuously evolves throughout its life to incentivize consumers to jump in early. It has the benefit of fostering a unique communal environment around the game's own evolution, but the drawback of taking choice and power away from the consumer in the name of fostering that community. Modes and features may be restricted to enhance the play experience, but good intentions aside, it doesn't change the fact that modes and features are nonetheless restricted. But Plants vs. Zombies 2 was designed for mobile, where a $60 price tag would never fly. And the Netflix-style subscription model doesn't work as well when your service is a single experience.
The logical business conclusion, then, is not to charge consumers for the service itself, but for things within the service with a microtransaction model. It pays the bills, pays the developers, or at least their bosses, and ensures consumers will download the service. And all it sacrifices is, well, the integrity of the entire product. No biggie.
Are you struggling to find information online? Too much SEO slopping up your search engines? Throw that browser in the trash and grab a library card. Books are jam-packed with the sorts of useful knowledge the internet can't provide. There's no need for AI summaries when you have access to an actual authorial voice. Use the internet to find your local library, and then throw it in the trash because you won't need it anymore. Not when you have access to thousands of books through the interlibrary loan system, available for the low price of absolutely free, coming to a library near you.
George Fan saw where this model could lead. He wasn't particularly interested in making a sequel to his masterpiece to begin with, believing that he had already accomplished everything he wanted to accomplish with the first title. But after already expressing trepidation at lowering prices for the original's mobile release, his response to a freemium approach being taken with the sequel was beyond negative.
But unlike the first game, there would be no compromise with Plants vs. Zombies 2. When discussing the questionable ethics behind games as service and free-to-play business models with the higher-ups at PopCap, the response he got was expected. They had all gone through the same logical thought process without considering the consequences that those decisions would have on the end consumers and the developers. After all, consumer ethics don't help profits. It's easy to frame this sort of decision as a form of corporatist greed, inherently immoral and unacceptable. But it's also important to understand that humanitarianism is a choice that people have to consciously make. Going through the motions of business is easy when looking at it through exclusively Excel spreadsheets and the like. Business, through the very nature of what business is, inherently only cares about the bottom line. Business doesn't innately care about the consumer. Business doesn't care about its workers, its clients, and its products until those workers, clients, and products affect the net income and net growth of the business itself. Many theorize that Fan was fired from PopCap due to his fairly strong stance on the sequel to his art, but all parties have dismissed these allegations. It'd be nice to think of Fan as a humanitarian hero, fighting an evil corporation, but things are rarely so black and white. Instead, the reason for Fan's departure was most likely the same reason Plants vs. Zombies 2 used the pricing model it did. Risk-taking makes a lot of sense when it's coming from a small team of passionate developers, but it makes a lot less sense with big teams, large budgets, and high stakes. Fan left a cushy corporate job at Blizzard to make Plants vs. Zombies, but his art became so successful that it turned into a new set of cushions to sink into. Plants vs. Zombies, from a corporate perspective, couldn't afford to do anything but the safest possible option. As they say, that's just business. The premise of Plants vs. Zombies 2, when separated from its economy, is actually quite novel. Cleverly subtitled It's About Time, the sequel sees Crazy Dave, the bizarre figurehead and shopkeeper of the first title, taking the player on a time-traveling quest for a missing taco, defending themselves from the zombie horde in all manner of areas and locales. The idea of expanding the Plants vs. Zombies concept beyond the suburban home is a compelling one, and with ancient Egypt, the pirate seas, and the Wild West launching with the service, the future of the game admittedly looked quite exciting. Every world came with its own distinct map, each with its own set of branching paths and rewards. There were 10 or so numbered levels, but also side levels and additional challenges in existing levels, from not planning on Crazy Dave's ever-precious mold colonies to making sure one specific pre-placed plant doesn't get eaten. Playing these side paths and extra challenges often rewarded players with extra seed slots, extra plants, and stars, which allow players to jump ahead to future worlds early. This seems to mirror the first game's design of giving players alternative activities and objectives that, when completed, would make the main progression a bit easier. But the biggest flaw with this setup was that many of these branching paths were hidden behind locked gates. Zombies would occasionally drop keys to these gates, but keys could also be purchased for a small fee. This essentially serves to punish amateur players by forcing them to either grind through levels to get all of the keys, or fork over some cash to get past them instantly. Gameplay within the levels largely mirrors the first title in terms of basic setup. Sun falls from the sky, and sunflowers can be used to help expedite that process. Sun can then be spent to set up plants to counter the zombie horde that's slowly invading from the right side of the screen. What changed in the sequel is the addition of 2 different forms of power-ups that can be activated at any time during a level. The first of these power-ups is for the plants. Plant food adds a surprising amount of complexity to basic gameplay, despite seeming like a fairly additive mechanic at first. The food essentially acts as a temporary buff for a plant, which enables it to perform a sort of super move. When planted on a pea shooter, for instance, it'll fire a high-capacity round of peas at machine gun speeds down the same row. But when planted on the cabbage-pult, it'll launch a piece of cabbage at every single enemy on the lawn. This not only adds another factor to consider when deciding what plants to equip for a level, it also adds another factor to consider when deciding where and when plants should be planted and plant food activated. There's also a risk-reward element with plant food, as the player has a limited supply of plant food slots, and zombies drop them quite rarely. Unfortunately, all of this is completely ruined by the little plus symbol to the right of the plant food meter, which prompts the player to spend some of their in-game currency to buy more plant food. Like the last game, in-game currency can be acquired from zombies and is frequently a reward for clearing a level. But unlike the last game, it can also be purchased using real-world money or earned by watching an ad.
Has this ever happened to you? Wow! Well, did you know that planet Jupiter, you can go? Look, it's got a little spot. Looks like a pepperoni, huh? Like my mom always says, if it looks like a pizza, how bad could it pizza? Hello, I am the president of Spirit Halloween, and I am proud to announce Planet Jupiter. Hello, I am the president of Bass Pro Shops, and I am pleased to announce that in partnership with Spirit Halloween, Planet Jupiter. Wow, so brave! Who would have thought all this buzz over a little old planet? Today and today only, Spirit Halloween and Bass Pro Shops are generously offering you can go to Planet Jupiter for only 16 payments of easy placentas and 19 nautical miles. So generous! And I think that's a good deal. Planet Jupiter, you get more stupider.
The other power-up, or rather power-ups, are for the player. These basically act as a last resort saving grace mechanic, which allows the player to use multi-touch gestures like pinching, dragging, and flicking in order to slow down or defeat zombies. These moves are extremely overpowered. In fact, the pinch was patched out and replaced pretty early in the game's life because it was even more powerful than the others. By default, these power-ups require spending coins on the spot, although free uses are very rarely rewarded for clearing certain challenges. Because both of these mechanics, especially the latter, substantially help the player clear out zombies, and both of these mechanics incentivize the spending of currency in order to use them, many players who feel they aren't able to clear some of the game's harder challenges are likely to lean towards using these power-ups instead of reevaluating their strategy and playing the game in different ways. And because the game's vital currency can be purchased with real-world money, the correlation between these mechanics and pay-to-win setups is fairly strong, especially with the player power-ups.
Many players will simply refuse to use the power-ups and refuse to purchase more plant food, but they'll soon find that many parts of the game are simply too challenging for them to not at least consider utilizing these mechanics.
One consequence of the worlds being larger is that late world levels and side challenges trade out interesting variations of existing mechanics in favor of just throwing boatloads of zombies at the player. This change in approach to level and difficulty design is annoying at best, but game-breakingly frustrating at worst. There are a number of levels in the game, especially boss battles, conveyor-style levels, and levels with other types of restrictions that either are effectively impossible to beat without spending coins on power-ups or plant food, or just flat-out come down to luck. This is something that the first game deliberately went out of its way to avoid with its incredibly well-paced levels.
But for Plants vs. Zombies 2, this increase in difficulty makes a lot of sense from a business perspective. In the first title, the purchase happened before the game begins, so the game was designed around making players feel like they got good value for money. Because purchases in the sequel happen within the app itself, it only makes sense for levels to incentivize spending real-world money on these microtransaction elements. The game had to be designed around these elements to some degree in order for this business model to work.
This video is sponsored by the Carnival. Go to the Carnival.
You're gonna put the apron on me? Oh, okay. Okay. Okay, you're gonna hand me this little disc? Alright, here. Alright, okay, this is fun. Alright, I'm gonna put my hand out. My hand out like this. Okay, I know we're rotating. Oh, we're rotating. Alright, and I gotta sit on this bike. Look at this tiny bike. Oh my god, what a car.
Hashtag give me money.
It's a shame because as the service continued to evolve, the new content brought with it some incredibly inventive ideas to the Plants vs. Zombies formula. While the worlds themselves may overstay their welcome and get far too difficult towards the end, the introduction of new worlds came with new mechanics that forced players to rethink their typical plant setup in far more drastic ways than anything in the first title. Frostbite Caves, for instance, combines two mechanics: tiles that force zombies to move to an adjacent lane, and a cold, chilly breeze that eventually freezes over plants and renders them unusable. The impending threat of plants freezing over necessitates the use of very specific plants and arrangements, but the tiles throw a wrench in those plants, forcing players to bump up the number of plants in more vulnerable rows, and in doing so, exposing them to the snowy cold. Big Wave Beach turns the pool mechanic from the first game on its side
by featuring a changing tide that destroys non-aquatic plants that aren't on lily pads. The 25 sun cost and recharge time for lily pads place a soft limit on how much players can play beyond the tide line, but in many cases the space beyond the tide isn't quite enough for the necessary arsenal to push back the zombie horde. Some world gimmicks are better than others, with the Far Future and Lost Cities' respective tile systems doing very little to fundamentally change gameplay. But more in a general sense, these mechanics are compelling on a surface level. In this sense, the reveal of a new world calls back to the inherent appeal of a service. It gives something genuinely new and exciting that keeps its user base coming back. Instead of merely revealing a pack of levels in existing areas, these sort of reveals meant a substantial change or progression in gameplay more often than not. And in the years since It's About Time's original release, the game's expanded to be far larger than the first title in every respect. Not only do these worlds mechanically stretch Plants vs. Zombies based mechanics farther than anything in the original title, but they also thematically match the premise of traveling through space and time incredibly well. The zombies in particular do an amazing job at transporting the player to the period of a particular world, from the medieval Dark Ages to the prehistoric Jurassic Marsh. The plants, meanwhile, get rather redundant over time, with a number of plants serving very similar purposes as other plants. The bloomerang has a lot of utility in the early game, being the only plant that can attack all zombies in a row at the same time. But upon starting Far Future, the cleverly named laser bean effectively renders it useless. Similarly, the primal pea shooter from Jurassic Marsh is designed to push zombies back as a counter to the brutal dinosaur kick, rendering the spring bean completely moot. But at a measly 175 sun, it also serves as a complete replacement for the repeater. When compared to the leaner lineup of the first title, Plants vs. Zombies 2's plant lineup comes off as quite bloated and overwhelming. This mitigates the sort of beautiful, accessible simplicity that defines George Van's work as a game director. When starting a level in Plants vs. Zombies 2, the first thing players see is a preview of the kinds of zombies they may encounter on the right side of the screen, with a plant selection menu on the left. The very act of scrolling through this massive list is tedious in and of itself, let alone deciding what kinds of plants make the most sense for the encounter ahead. Often, it isn't clear what the best choices are until after players fail at least once. This wasn't really an issue in the first game, in part because of how comparatively easy it is, but mostly because the plant selection was far more limited.
Naturally, the plant selection is this large for a reason, and naturally, it's a financially motivated one.
Unlike the first game, which only allowed extra seed slots to be purchased through the in-game economy as a sort of handicap, Plants vs. Zombies 2 rewards a 7th slot about halfway through the Pirate Seas somewhat arbitrarily, and puts the 8th slot up for sale at a steep $4.99. Alternatively, it can be rented for use in a single level. While tons of new plants are exciting in their own way, the intimidation that inherently comes with having to only pick 6 or 7 of over 100 different plants pressures players into buying that 8th seed slot. In addition to that extra slot, a number of premium plants can be purchased on top of the dozens of other plants. On occasion, these can be used in a number of specialty levels throughout the campaign as a sort of teaser for what kind of benefits these plants could potentially provide. But in normal play, they also cost a hefty $4.99, or in some cases, 100 of a separate currency called gems. These gems can be earned in small increments throughout normal play of the game's extra modes, or watching advertisements, but can also be purchased for real money. These gems weren't in the game's initial release, but were added in an early post-launch update. This falls in line with the tactics of many other microtransaction-heavy titles. Similar to how overwhelming the player with plants can pressure players to purchase an additional slot, throwing numerous currency types at the player can pressure the spending of real-world money simply to avoid the confusion and tedium associated with earning these currencies in-game.
Many of these things weren't implemented initially because building out these features likely didn't make sense without a dedicated user base to use those features. Or to put it bluntly, they needed people to financially exploit before they could build the tool to financially exploit them with.
In a world where you're a bunny, and there's hay to munch on, and lettuce to eat, and your butt really needs to get brushed, and the carrot your owner gave you went undiscovered for a solid 2 minutes, there is a lot of poop. Bandit. Coming soon to theaters. Also included in the MML's Commentaries DVD box set.
Since the launch of the Plants vs. Zombies 2 service, the product players would find on their smartphones changed significantly, in far more reconstructive ways than simply adding new plants and worlds. One of the most apparent additions upon opening the game today is the complete reworking of the overworld maps. The locked gates, varied pathways, and distinct look has since been replaced with a linear path of levels placed on top of a generic swirly backdrop. What were initially optional side levels and extra challenges have since been directly implemented into the core level progression, serving to make that progression more confusing than it already was. Players that spent real-world money on keys to unlock those levels, naturally, would not get a refund. To somewhat make up for that, world keys were added to the game, which enabled players to play worlds in any order, completely destroying any sense of flow or cohesion that the already loose narrative had. There's nothing quite like watching Dr. Zomboss's master plan activate in modern day, playing for over 20 hours in older worlds, then beating Jurassic Marsh and being told that Project Paradox is almost ready. That's a paradox in more ways than the developers likely ever intended. This only further exacerbates the plant redundancy issue from earlier. The spring bean may be completely useless in a world with the primal pea shooter, but at least before, the primal pea shooter wasn't accessible for most of the game. After this update, players could jump ahead to Jurassic Marsh, pick up the primal pea shooter, then return to the Pirate Seas, an area which heavily leans on the player's use of the spring bean, and completely destroy that entire world. As a result, the game gets monumentally more confusing for players. Many levels in later worlds were originally designed under the impression that players had completely cleared all prior worlds, and many of the conveyor-style levels or minigames are more than willing to throw plants into the mix that haven't been unlocked yet. Players' likely lack of preparedness for the later worlds that they may choose to unlock early increases the likelihood that, in a moment of desperation, they break out the wallet to make a level easier. From the player perspective, that's a bad thing, but from a business perspective, that's not just a good thing, that's the goal. World keys were touted as a huge addition to the game, and were used frequently in promotions, with the express goal of having players unlock more worlds that they aren't prepared for and spend money as a result. Sometimes players would boot up the game and instantly receive a free world key for no reason as part of a promotion. In 2016, this initiative reached its logical conclusion with the Keysplosion update, which unlocked all worlds for players after getting part way through ancient Egypt. Comically, world keys were removed from the game in a later update and replaced with world-specific keys, which solved some problems while creating new ones. World progression was effectively reverted back to being fully linear, meaning the only way to get to Pirate Seas is to first get through a whopping 25 levels of ancient Egypt. Later worlds get even longer, and as the game gets harder and increasingly more willing to put the player in nearly unwinnable circumstances, it gets incredibly frustrating, and as a result, much easier for a player to progress by draining their wallet.
This final, hyperlinear iteration of the game's progression is handily the worst of the lot, and goes completely against the original context with which the levels were designed to be played. The willingness to completely change the structure of the game several times over shows an obvious preference for flexibility and insecurity over intentional design, and a clear disregard for developer input and creative vision.
The first iteration of the world map was arguably its best, but kept being changed for the sake of adapting to market trends, keeping the game interesting years after release, and attempting to squeeze more money out of its player base. Often, it doesn't feel like the game was adequately balanced or tested before these massive changes to the game structure were made. Contrarily, this level of unfairness and extreme difficulty may not be viewed as a bug so much as a money-making feature.
Today's video is sponsored by opening a chair and putting it together. I have no idea what chair this is. I don't know what brand it is. We're not sponsored by the chair. We're merely sponsored by the act of putting this chair together. So I'm gonna open it now. So we got a lot of bubble wrap. We've got an arm. We've got an arm. A component. The back. One of these. One of these. Most importantly, a bunch of put together stuff. Oh wait, there's something else. We've also got a bunch of these. So you may be wondering, why would the act of assembling a chair, why would that action sponsor me? Reason number one is because, the person you're assembling the chair for, they'll be happy. They'll be happy that you did it. The second reason why it's good to assemble chairs is because you get to learn the alphabet. I mean, all these things here, there's O's and N's and J's and M's and Q's. You might not know all those letters, but they do exist. Like, then you get the N screws out and you're like, oh, what words start with N? Nice, which is what you're being, assembling a chair. My point's made. Reason number 3 is definitely because it helps you remember where you put your stuff. I lose this freaking Allen wrench all the time. A1 and K2. Oh my goodness. We're doing all the letters and numbers. Even though the regular like Allen wrench that comes in these kits are annoying and not the best, I do like that they have 2 sides to them, so you can like get at stuff from different angles. Another reason, I don't know what number we're at. Hey, you know, like there's some creative thinking skills you gotta apply with this. Oh, this doesn't tighten all the way properly. Maybe I add another washer. Maybe I, you know, the instructions were wrong about the order of the washers. It's all about some degree of intuition. So the final reason why you should definitely partake in assembling a chair, you know, what are you doing with your life? Watching an hour-long video about a dead gaming franchise, that's what you're doing with your time? Like, come on, like, go out and buy goods and services using the money that you don't have, and then dedicate time to building one of them because the money that you spent to buy the thing wasn't enough to get it assembled. This is a horribly designed cap for a thing, but it's my horribly designed cap to this thing. Partake in commerce. It's the only way to have a meaningful something in our semi-antiquated society. That didn't work.
Later updates added even more to the game. Today, plants can now level up and arbitrarily become more powerful. Plants can be boosted and instantly get their plant food effect upon planting. Mints were added as an entire third currency, specifically for a new class of buff plants called empowerments. Pinata parties, daily challenges, a competitive arena battle mode, the return of the vase breaker minigame. From a purely quantitative standpoint, there's an absolutely immense amount of features and modes here. But from a consumer experience standpoint, it sure is a lot of bars and timers to look at. Booting up the game today bombards players with things they can or should do. Be sure to play this Pinata party before it expires. Be sure to enter the arena before the tournament ends. Check out the plan of the week. Get those sweet sale deals in the store. Complete quests, earn gems, earn coins, because as the game quite literally spells out at times, it's fun. What makes all of this especially bad is that Plants vs. Zombies players are already primed to view being overwhelmed as part of the core gameplay experience. Plants vs. Zombies is a game inherently about giving the player too many things to click and forcing them to make tough decisions about what to click first. Instead of this overstimulation encouraging strategic play in the sequel, however, it's instead designed for players to give up on strategic play and break out the wallet instead. This is the design approach that quite literally had to be taken to keep players engaged in the game and, more importantly, spending money. These features need to be constantly advertised in-game, because while Plants vs. Zombies 1 is a product, Plants vs. Zombies 2 is instead a product delivery service. As much as the worlds and levels may feel like a product, they're not. The products are the premium plants, the extra coins, the power-ups, because those are what make money. Plants vs. Zombies 2 is a fun game. It's also a really successful game. There's no denying the fact that a lot of people really enjoy what Plants vs. Zombies 2 has to offer. Unfortunately, a fine piece of art, whether interactive, auditory, or visual, is only as good as the context under which it's presented. Art can be enjoyable, fun, or moving, but as it evolves, as more and more of these psychologically manipulative, financially exploitative features and elements creep their way in, the purity of that art is almost certainly going to be degraded. Over time, these elements become so overwhelming, so domineering, and so stress-inducing that it becomes hard to even see what made that piece of art so incredibly enjoyable to begin with.
I think the biggest mistake that people make about their favorite things is that they assume that the thing they love so much was made as a labor of uninhibited love in a sort of metaphorical vacuum. Ultimately, we're all living in this world together, And we all happen to live in a world where we have to pay rent, we have to pay to eat, we have to pay to maintain our lifestyles. In most societal economic structures, we're all ultimately competing against each other whether we want to or not, whether it be fighting for jobs in a limited market, sanitizing online content to be more search engine and ad-friendly, or exploiting your customer base with microtransactions. This competition is inherent to the way our current society functions, and to be blunt, it sucks. No matter how much we may care about the things we create, there's always going to be an incentive to make it that much more marketable, more profitable, and more economical. Because at the end of the day, that selfishness is what puts food on the table. It's sad, but for that reason, true artistic purity, art for art's sake, just plain doesn't exist. And that's why I'm sitting here in front of this camera today and ask you to contribute just $1 to my page.
So what happened after Plants vs. Zombies 2? For starters, Plants vs. Zombies became a third-person shooter. Believe it or not, when young children and adolescents talk about Plants vs. Zombies today, in all likelihood, they're talking about these games. The Garden Warfare games borrowed initially from Team Fortress 2 and later from hero shooters like Overwatch and Apex to essentially fashion the plant-zombie conflict into a more conventional gaming format. The games bleed charm, are quite enjoyable to play, and especially with later games in the series, have an impressive amount of content, but they don't exactly do anything artistically compelling or innovative. In all likelihood, however, that was intentional. Designing Garden Warfare and its contemporaries to push boundaries would be too risky of an investment when juggling the larger budgets associated with these titles. And the casual audience of the main series isn't playing PlayStation or Xbox. Through this logic, the safest and most logical move would be to place the basic Plants vs. Zombies conflict into the most popular gaming genre of the time and mash up ideas from better games to make it happen. Of course, these games are overflowing with micropay elements. A hefty upcharge was no reason to not treat these games the same way as Plants vs. Zombies 2 on mobile. Not as a game or a work of art, but instead as a content delivery service.
A loot box scandal in Garden Warfare 2 got some backlash, but it did very little to stop EA from happily announcing that paid content will be coming to Battle for Neighborville after launch, which only didn't happen because the active player base abandoned the hero shooter genre and Neighborville by proxy and jumped over to Fortnite before microtransactions could be implemented.
After Neighborville, the next frontier for Plants vs. Zombies was reported to be a single-player title that expanded on elements from Neighborville's single-player campaign and combined them with more traditional action-adventure game tropes. This game was scrapped in favor of having the team work on a Star Wars game, which was also scrapped. Since then, that whole team was reorged out of PopCap Games entirely. Back on mobile, another direction the series went in was the digital card game space, borrowing heavily from the likes of Hearthstone. Where the Garden Warfare games were designed to appeal to a console demographic, Plants vs. Zombies Heroes appealed to the same demographic as the main series, releasing on iOS and Android devices in 2016. With Plants vs. Zombies 2 development winding down but not fully stopping, Heroes was likely designed to serve as a complement to it, or perhaps as a stopgap until Plants vs. Zombies 3 was ready. The game's slower pace and increased focus on tactics is different enough to serve as a secondary pillar to the core titles rather than an outright replacement that risks losing too much revenue. It's also likely that the game was designed in the way it was to adapt to a vertical display format so that it can be played with one hand. In the era before TikTok but after Snapchat, right in the midst of the vertical video revolution, app developers at the time suspected that maybe no one wanted to exert the massive amount of energy it takes to rotate their mobile device 90 degrees. The world of mobile gaming changed monumentally in the 10+ years since It's About Time launched, diving even deeper into the world of incremental upgrades and RPG elements. Cookie Clicker launched the same year as Plants vs. Zombies 2 and ushered in a massive wave of idle games, a perfect fit for mobile devices that mostly live in pockets and purses. Possibly as a means of contextualizing the progress bars, mobile games also trended towards farmvilling or homescaping themselves. These systems all serve to reel players in to tap things on screen, watch progress bars grow, and eventually break out the wallet.
While there was a time when highly immersive mobile gaming experiences were on the App Store, the biggest success stories of the late 2010s come from a non-committal approach. Instead of encouraging users to keep the app open and continuously consume content,
The new strategy is to focus on the frequency with which apps are opened and bombard users with countless notifications to remind them to do so. This, to put it bluntly, is the exact opposite of what Plants vs. Zombies was originally all about.
It's this new reality that the original build of Plants vs. Zombies 3, which had a public alpha release in 2020, entered into. The goal of the title was not to follow up on PvZ2 with some new creative ideas, nor to evolve the formula in a new exciting way. Its express goal was to make $100 million in its first year after launch. In a move that seemed to be designed to appeal to as wide a demographic as humanly possible, the game was simplified to the point of being insulting to its players. Sunflowers were removed from the game entirely and replaced with a static progress bar. There's a larger emphasis on plant food. There's an opportunity to rearrange plants halfway through every battle. The game wasn't even designed around conventional levels. Instead, as EA's marketing put it, it was a modern mobile experience, complete with, as expected, a whole neighborhood to maintain, progress bars to fill, and numerous places to spend money. The levels of Plants vs. Zombies 2 were certainly messy, but at the very least they were still arguably the main focus of the game. Here, the idle game and town elements took higher priority than the traditional Plants vs. Zombies gameplay. The service no longer was the distraction from the game. The service itself had become the game. The biggest laugh was its status as a closed alpha. The claim was that this status is to give early access to players and receive feedback on the direction of the game. But in reality, the so-called feedback opportunity is perhaps better described as getting free labor from customers. Because the game is in development, it gives an excuse for any potential bugs in the experience. In essence, these early access users were an unpaid labor force of 10,000 bug testers. After enough bugs and issues were discovered, the game was pulled from storefronts in November 2020.
Reportedly, as more and more people were leaving PopCap over the years, their jobs weren't being replaced. Instead, more of the game's assets were sourced overseas to subcontracted companies in cheaper labor markets. There's no reason to invest in a talented local artist when the only goal is to maximize profit. There's no reason to care about company morale and team building in an environment where the market reigns supreme and creativity takes a massive backseat. All that matters is that impossible to reach $100 million revenue target.
In the years since, Plants vs. Zombies 3 would pop up every now and again with little updates and small closed betas. Development updates felt insecure. At least to an outsider, it felt as though PopCap was scrambling to adapt to market trends. As phones grew larger and mobile gaming shifted back towards horizontal orientation, suddenly Plants vs. Zombies 3 shifted back as well. As an absolute onslaught of brain-dead puzzle games invaded app stores, suddenly Plants vs. Zombies 3's levels grew monumentally shorter and less interesting, with reduced play space and virtually no flexibility for players. As the industry as a whole moved towards making their games look more stylized and unique, suddenly Plants vs. Zombies 3 looks worse. It just looks worse. Finally, in January 2024, Plants vs. Zombies 3 Welcome to Zomburbia was formally re-announced with a press release, a new subtitle, a whimper, and a soft launch in select countries. It remains to be seen when the game will see a proper global release and how successful that global release will be. That said, it's not looking good. After over a decade of mining this IP for all it's worth, it's finally beginning to seem as though this well is running dry. As mentioned, Battle for Neighborville was abandoned fairly quickly after launch, and the active player base for PvZ2 and Heroes continues to shrink by the day. Many of the folks who grew to love the tower defense gameplay of the original title have grown up and moved on, and children on average aren't diversifying their palette too far beyond the massive live gaming service juggernauts of Fortnite, Minecraft, and Roblox. There's still graphic novels, merchandise, and plenty else, but Plants vs. Zombies just isn't as valuable of an asset as it was back when it was nothing more than a great video game.
Plants vs. Zombies initially appeared to be a blossoming franchise with nowhere to grow but upward. But now, the series is worse than dead. It's been zombified. And this zombification isn't something that any one person can take the blame for. Games are developed by dozens, sometimes hundreds of people. And while a single director or producer can make a decision that dramatically affects their staff and the final product, it's reductive and ultimately inaccurate to say that every bad thing is exclusively their fault.
First, while some staff at PopCap may be complicit and in agreement with this direction, the higher-ups at publisher EA are really the ones who make the sorts of decisions that impacted the developers the most, from deadlines to pricing models to budget. But secondly, EA isn't exactly worth blaming either, because to the business people there, these decisions appear to be the most financially sound ones. The saddest part about business is that eventually, trends change and companies have to pivot. If there's nothing novel or interesting about a product on its own merit, if it's merely just an IP slapped on a market-optimized piece of board-approved content, it absolutely has artistic value regardless, but that value arguably hinges more on how the market receives it than anything else. There may be another reality where the ideas of Plants vs. Zombies 2 or Garden Warfare were developed outside of the context of the 2010s gaming landscape and allowed to stand on their own, but they almost certainly would have made less money and likely would have been deemed a failure. Meanwhile, it remains to be seen for sure, but it doesn't seem like Plants vs. Zombies 3, in its desperation to capture a market for itself, has any original ideas worth standing on. As for that market, there is a bit of hope for mobile gaming's future. While gaming on Mac has never really taken off, the processors in the iPhone have gotten so powerful that porting console-caliber games to the platform is finally possible. The Nintendo Switch's massive success as a hybrid handheld device has pushed numerous other companies in that direction. Platforms like Xbox Game Pass and Steam have also pushed gaming in a more hardware-agnostic direction, in which games can be purchased on a PC or game console and then played on a separate mobile device with save data seamlessly synchronizing between both, and without the need to purchase a game multiple times. The sun may very well be beginning to set on the era of dedicated mobile gaming. The bigger concern is the live service gaming model, which has continued to slowly infect its way into the AAA game space. Outside of mobile, massive titles like Fortnite, Minecraft, and Roblox aren't getting sequels anytime soon because these games have become product delivery systems for skins, accessories, and plenty else, more so than games in their own right. Eventually they'll be bled dry like Plants vs. Zombies, just perhaps a bit slower. Plants vs. Zombies was as profitable as it was because of the miserable state it's in, not in spite of it. In a world of services, media delivery platforms, excessive merchandising, and invasive advertising, the fate of Plants vs. Zombies is merely symptomatic of the world we live in. We can't blame companies or directors or producers or executives. Well, not on their own anyway, because ultimately, the real thing that killed Plants vs. Zombies is
Wow, you did it! You made it! That was a big one. I mean, I know in the YouTube landscape today, 3-hour video, 4-hour video. This was only 1 hour, so, rookie numbers. However, it felt large to me, and it's been a long time in the making as well. This was a 6-year process. I started writing this back in 2018. Kind of waiting for the right time, partially, but it kind of worked out because, when I decided that this was going to be the next thing, Plants vs. Zombies 3 wasn't re-announced yet, so sometimes things work out in weird ways. And before I get to the thank yous and the shout outs and all that fun stuff, there is one thing I do want to say, which is, despite the satire and the parody and all that, I want to make it clear that I actually don't have any issue with people taking brand deals and sponsorships and, selling merch and having Patreon pages and all that fun stuff. And if you think that was the point, I encourage you to maybe think a bit more deeply about the themes in the video and, this is sort of to my own benefit, but watch it again, maybe. I don't know. It goes a little bit deeper than that. And actually, some of the things in the joke ads were real. Like the t-shirts, they're real. You can actually go buy them. I'm not selling a DVD set, but so be it. But that's all I'll say about the video. I hope you enjoyed it. Like I said, this was a long time in the making, and as a result, there's a lot of people that helped me throughout the process. I mean, James made the thumbnail. James makes thumbnails for like most of your favorite YouTubers in this space. Thank you to Dennis and Chariot and my friend Nick and the guy at the car, and just anyone who did anything relating to the ads that appeared in this thing. Just thank you so much for that. And then of course, there's tons of other people that I'm thanking in the somewhere over here, and they're tagged in the description as well. I do have a feeling that because this process was so long, there's gonna be a lot of people that are like, what did I do? But you know, I keep track of it. You did something. I like thanking and giving credit to literally anyone who like even remotely like breathed on the video. So with that, you know, it's time for the self promo segment. You know, I play the game too. So there's two other videos that I'm going to recommend for you to watch. The first one is about the Peanuts animated catalog. I can't believe that video is 2 years old now. But yeah, it's about the Peanuts comic strip and how it adapted to animated specials, and how there's interesting creative challenges that come with adapting something from one medium to another medium, and how, you know, you get surprising outcomes out of that maybe wouldn't happen in the original medium. So I'm proud of it. It's actually the most viewed video in the channel's history, so thanks for that. And then the second video I want to recommend is a weird one, but eggs. I made a video about scrambled eggs. It was part of a collab, but you know, it's a lot of fun. It's a short, breezy 10 minutes by comparison, and it's a lot of fun, so go check that one out. This video is the end of Season 2, as I'm calling it, of MML's Commentaries, which probably doesn't mean anything to you, other than the fact that there's going to be like a little Season 2 reflection video that comes in the future, and then the next thing will be the start of Season 3. But other than that, you know, I'm already diving head first to the next thing, and hopefully it won't take, you know, as long to get that one out, but we'll see what happens. With that, you know, stay tuned for more. You know, I made a joke about it earlier, but you know, twist the doohickey, subscribe to the channel and all that. I don't know. Just thank you. Thank you for everything. I'm continually humbled by just people giving their time. Like, this was an hour long. If you're here, like, that's an hour of your time that you could have spent doing anything else, and you chose to watch this instead. So I'm eternally grateful for that, and I hope you stick around for what comes next. Thanks so much.
We just have footage of you sitting here staring to
Yep. We're eating up all that SD card space. Now everyone is doing everything. Manistu's over here. Oh my god.
Do you want me to
Yeah, you can stop. You can stop for